For 60 years, James Walker has kept a secret about what he heard at Wilson's Diner. A secret so heavy, it shaped his entire life. Now, at 82, he's finally ready to break his silence and reveal the truth about that August night in 1963. A truth that will change how we understand courage, choices, and the cost of silence. This is the story of a young man's moment of fear, an old man's burden of guilt, and the unexpected letter that finally set him free. James Walker's hands shook as he poured tea into 2 small cups. At 82 years old, his fingers weren't as steady as they used to be. But today, the shaking wasn't just from age. "Sugar?" he asked the young woman sitting on his worn but clean sofa. "Yes, please. Just 1 spoon," Maya Thomas replied, her reporter's notebook already open on her lap. She was barely 30, with bright eyes that missed nothing. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple blue dress that reminded James of his late wife's favorite color. James dropped a sugar cube into her cup with a small splash. "Sorry about that," he said, handing her the cup. "No problem at all, Mr. Walker. I appreciate you letting me interview you." Maya smiled, taking a sip of the tea. "This is good. My Evelyn's special blend. Been making it the same way for 60 years now." James settled into his old armchair across from Maya, the springs creaking beneath his thin frame. "Even though she's been gone 5 years, some habits don't leave you." Maya nodded and looked around the small living room. The walls were covered with family photos, children growing up, graduations, weddings, new babies. But there was one spot right above the old television where the wallpaper was slightly darker, like something had hung there for years and then been removed. "You have a beautiful family," Maya said. 4 children, 9 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren now, James said with pride. "My youngest granddaughter just had a baby boy last month, named him James after me." He pointed to a picture on the side table. "That's little James. He's the newest addition." Maya smiled at the photo of the tiny baby. "He's adorable." James nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Now, you said you wanted to talk about growing up in Alabama during the Civil Rights era?" "Yes, sir." Maya clicked her pen. "I'm working on a series about everyday people who lived through those times. Not just the famous leaders we all know about, but regular folks like yourself. The untold stories." James took a deep breath. "Well, I was born in 1943 in Oakwood, Alabama, small town about 30 miles south of Birmingham. And you lived there until when?" "Until I went to college in 1963. Moved back after I got my teaching degree, though. Taught science at the high school for 42 years. Maya scribbled in her notebook. "What was it like growing up there in the 50s? James stared into his teacup for a moment. "Different times. Very different. We knew our place, as they used to say." His voice had a slight bitter edge. Separate schools, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains. Couldn't try on clothes in the stores downtown. Had to wait until all white customers were served before we could buy anything. "That must have been difficult," Maya said softly. "It was just life. You don't question the air you breathe when you're a child. It just is." James shifted in his chair. "My parents did their best to protect us from the worst of it, taught us to be proud of who we were, but also how to stay safe." "Did you work while you were in school?" James nodded. "Started shining shoes when I was 12. Then at 17, I got a job cleaning up at Wilson's Diner after closing time." Maya looked up from her notebook. "Wilson's Diner. I've been researching Oakwood. Wasn't that on Main Street? The building is a civil rights museum now, I think." James's hand suddenly froze, the teacup halfway to his lips. A drop spilled onto his crisp white shirt. He didn't seem to notice. "Mr. Walker, are you all right?" Maya asked, leaning forward with concern. James set down his cup slowly. His eyes had gone distant, like he was seeing something far beyond the walls of his tidy living room. "I haven't spoken about that place in 60 years, he said, his voice suddenly firm. Maya looked confused. "I'm sorry. I just mentioned it because it's a famous local landmark now. We don't have to talk about it if you'd rather not." James stood up and walked over to the mantelpiece. He picked up an old pocket watch that sat there, rubbing his thumb over its worn silver case. "It's not that I don't want to talk about it," he said after a long moment. "It's that I've never talked about it. Not to anyone." He turned to face Maya. "Not even my Evelyn knew the whole truth." Maya set her notebook aside. "Mr. Walker, we can discuss something else if—" "No," James cut her off gently. "Maybe it's time. Maybe that's why you're here." He looked down at the watch in his hand, then made a decision. "There's something that happened there that I've never told anyone, not even my family." He returned to his chair, still holding the pocket watch. His eyes met Maya's, and she was surprised to see them shining with unshed tears. "You came here looking for untold stories about those times," James said. "Well, I've got one for you, but I need to know it'll be told right." Maya nodded slowly. "I promise to tell it exactly as you share it with me, Mr. Walker." James looked down at the watch again, running his finger over its scratched surface. It was August 1963. I was 17 years old, just weeks away from leaving for college. His voice grew stronger as he continued. "What I saw and heard that night at Wilson's Diner has haunted me for 60 years. He closed his eyes for a moment, his weathered face showing the weight of decades. When he opened them again, there was a new resolve there. "I think I'm finally ready to break my silence," James said. "But you need to understand everything. Where I came from, what those times were really like, to make sense of why I kept quiet for so long." Maya picked up her notebook again. "I'm listening, Mr. Walker. Take all the time you need." James nodded, took a deep breath, and began his story. "I was born in 1943, right in the middle of World War II. My daddy, Henry Walker, was a mechanic. Best one in Oakwood, truth be told. White folks would bring their cars to him, even though there were white mechanics in town. They'd say, 'Henry's got the touch.' But they'd still make him work on their cars out back of his shop, not inside where people could see." James took a sip of his tea before continuing. "My mama, Rose, was a seamstress. She made dresses and shirts and did alterations. She had a small room in our house set up with her sewing machine and all her supplies. Mama's hands were always moving, always fixing something." Maya nodded, jotting notes as James spoke. "We lived in a small green house on Elm Street. It wasn't much, but Daddy kept it in good repair. I shared a room with my older brother, William, and my two sisters, Sarah and Ruth, shared another. We didn't have much money, but we never went hungry. Mama made sure of that." James's eyes softened with the memory. School was a 20-minute walk away. Oakwood Colored School, they called it then. It was one building with 8 classrooms. All the black children in town went there, grades 1 through 12. We had old books, hand-me-downs from the white school when they got new ones. Some pages were missing, and there were notes written in the margins. But our teachers were something special. He leaned forward, his voice growing stronger. Miss Jenkins was my favorite. She taught science. She'd bring in plants and bugs and rocks, anything to make our lessons come alive. She's the one who made me want to be a teacher myself. She told me, James Walker, that brain of yours is going places." And I believed her. Maya smiled. "She sounds wonderful." She was. Gave me extra books to read, too. Said I showed exceptional aptitude. I had to look that word up. He chuckled. "I dreamed of becoming a doctor back then. Wanted to wear a white coat and help people get better." His smile faded slowly. But Oakwood wasn't a place where black boys became doctors. Not in those days. Every day, we were reminded of our place. We couldn't use the front entrance at the movie theater. Had to go around back and sit in the balcony. Couldn't swim in the town pool. Couldn't eat inside at any restaurant in town. James stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out at his neat front yard. "Daddy taught us how to live in that world. Keep your head up, but your voice down," he'd always say. "Be proud of who you are, but be smart about how you show it." When white folks walked down the sidewalk, we had to step aside. If a white person came into a store where we were shopping, we had to wait until they were served, even if we'd been there an hour. He turned back to face Maya. My brother William didn't take to those rules so well. He was 3 years older than me, and he had a fire in him. He'd talk back sometimes, and Daddy would have to take him out to the woodshed. Not to hurt him, you understand, but to talk some sense into him. "They'll kill you, son," I heard him say once. "They'll kill you, and no one will say a word about it." James returned to his chair, sitting heavily. When I was 15, I started shining shoes downtown on Saturdays. Made a little money that way. Put every penny in a cigar box under my bed. College money, I called it. I was saving up so I could go to Tuskegee Institute. That was my dream. Maya nodded encouragingly. "And at 17, you started working at Wilson's Diner?" "That's right. Mr. Wilson needed someone to clean up after closing. Mopping floors, washing dishes, taking out trash. The pay was better than shining shoes, and it didn't hurt my knees so much." James picked up the pocket watch again, turning it over in his hands. Frank Wilson wasn't like most white business owners in town. He wasn't friendly exactly, but he wasn't cruel either. He ran that diner for 30 years before I started working there. It was whites only in the front dining room, but he had a small back room where black folks could order food to go. Some even sat at the 2 tables back there to eat. That was unusual for Oakwood. He set the watch down carefully. By 1963, things were changing. Not fast, and not without a fight. We'd see things on TV. Protests in Birmingham, the Freedom Riders getting beaten, Dr. King's speeches. My brother William started going to meetings at Bethel Church. They were planning sit-ins and marches, right there in Oakwood. James's voice grew quiet. Mama and Daddy were scared. William was 20 then, old enough to make his own choices, but they begged him to be careful. They'd tell him, "Think of your sisters. Think of James. What happens to them if something happens to you?" He paused, his eyes distant. I wanted to join those meetings too. Felt like history was happening, and I was just watching from the sidelines. But Mama put her foot down. "You're going to college in September," she told me. "You're our hope, James. You get that education, then you can change things." Maya wrote quickly, trying to capture every word. So I kept working at Wilson's, kept my head down, kept saving money. But that summer, the summer of '63, you could feel something in the air. Like a storm coming. Everyone knew it. White folks were angry and scared. Black folks were hopeful, but scared too. James reached for his teacup, found it empty, and set it down again. I was set to leave for Tuskegee in September. First one in my family to go to college. Daddy had even bought me a small suitcase from the Goodwill store. Mama was sewing me some new shirts. Everything was looking up. His face darkened. Then came that night, in August. August 12th, 1963. A Monday. It was hot, even for Alabama in the summer. The kind of heat that makes people mean. The diner had been slow that night. Mr. Wilson closed up early, around 9. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up like always. James stopped suddenly and looked at Maya. "You have to understand something. What happened next? I've never told another living soul. Not my parents, not my brother or sisters, not even my wife. For 60 years, I've kept this locked inside me." Maya put down her pen. "Mr. Walker, we can take a break, if you need." "No," James said firmly. "I've carried this long enough. It's time to set it down." He took another deep breath and continued, his voice steadier now. "I was cleaning the grill when I heard voices coming from Mr. Wilson's office." James paused, his forehead wrinkled in concentration. "But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened that night, you need to know what that summer was like in Oakwood." Maya nodded, flipping to a fresh page in her notebook. "The summer of 1963 was like nothing we'd seen before," James continued. Dr. King had led the Birmingham campaign that spring. We'd all seen the pictures in the newspaper: fire hoses, police dogs, children being arrested. Then in June, Governor Wallace stood in the doorway at the University of Alabama, trying to keep black students out. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes focused on something distant. Those events weren't happening in some faraway place. Birmingham was just 30 miles up the road. The University of Alabama was less than 2 hours away. It felt close, real close. He reached for the framed photo on the end table, a black and white picture of a young man in a graduation cap and gown. "That's me, high school graduation, May 1963. James handed the photo to Maya. "I was skinny back then, all arms and legs, but I had big dreams." Maya studied the picture of young James, his serious expression, his perfectly pressed suit under the graduation gown. That summer, everything was changing. You could feel it in the air, like electricity before a storm. James set the photo back on the table. My brother William was deep into the movement by then. He and some friends from church had started a local chapter of the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. James got up again, moving to his bookshelf. He pulled out an old shoebox and brought it back to his chair. William would come home with pamphlets and buttons. He opened the box and carefully removed a small pin that read, "We shall overcome." He gave me this, but Mama made me hide it. Said wearing it could cost me my job at the diner, maybe even my chance at college. Maya jotted notes as James continued. The white folks in town were nervous. Some were downright mean. The sheriff, Sheriff Dawson, he started arresting black men for the smallest things. Loitering, disturbing the peace, being uppity. That was his favorite charge. James shook his head. William's group was planning sit-ins at the lunch counters downtown. I remember the night he told us at dinner. Daddy's face went dark as a thundercloud. "They'll beat you bloody," he said. "Or worse." But William just shrugged. "Things have to change, Daddy," he said. "And change doesn't come without risk." James put the pin back in the box. Mama cried that night. I heard her through the wall. "They're going to kill my boy," she kept saying. Daddy just held her. There weren't any words to make it better. He closed the box and set it aside. I was caught in the middle. Part of me wanted to join William. Be brave like him. Stand up for what was right. But another part of me knew what my parents had sacrificed to get me this far. I was so close to getting out, going to college. I didn't want to risk that. James looked down at his weathered hands, so I kept working at Wilson's Diner. Every night, I'd clean until the place sparkled. Mr. Wilson never said much to me, but he'd nod when he checked my work. That nod meant something to me. Maya leaned forward. "Were there ever any incidents at the diner that summer?" James nodded slowly. "Nothing big at first. Some white customers complained about Mr. Wilson serving black folks in the back room, called him a N-word lover. He lost some business over it, but he kept that back room open." He took a sip of water from a glass on the side table. "Then, in July, someone threw a brick through the front window, had a note tied to it that said, 'Serve your own kind.' Mr. Wilson boarded up the window and opened for business the next day like nothing happened." James's voice dropped lower. "That wasn't the end of it, though. Mr. Wilson started getting phone calls, threats. I'd answer the phone sometimes when I was there, and they'd say awful things. 'Tell Frank his days are numbered,' or 'that diner's gonna burn with him in it.' I'd tell Mr. Wilson, and he'd just write it down in a little notebook he kept. Never seemed scared, just tired." Maya watched James carefully. His shoulders had tensed, and his breathing had quickened. The first weekend in August, William and his group held their sit-in. 12 of them went to Carter's lunch counter downtown, sat at the whites-only counter, and asked to be served. They were arrested within 10 minutes, charged with trespassing and disturbing the peace. James rubbed his eyes. Daddy had to borrow money to bail William out. When they got home, I'd never seen Daddy so angry. "You trying to get yourself killed?" he shouted. But William stood his ground. "I'm not going to live on my knees," he said. "I'd rather die on my feet." James shook his head again. The whole town was on edge after that. White men started patrolling the streets at night with baseball bats. They said they were keeping the peace, but everyone knew what it really was: intimidation. His voice grew softer. "I had my bus ticket to Tuskegee by then, September 15th departure. I kept it in my Bible, looking at it every night before bed. It was my way out, my ticket to a better life. Just a few more weeks of keeping my head down, I told myself. Just a few more weeks." James's hands were shaking slightly now. The Sunday after the sit-in, our pastor gave a sermon about courage, about doing what's right even when you're afraid. I felt like he was speaking directly to me. I felt ashamed that I wasn't brave like William, that I was choosing my future over the fight for all our futures. He stopped, taking a long, deep breath. The next day was August 12th. That Monday, I went to Wilson's Diner at my usual time, 7 o'clock. The dinner rush was over, and Mr. Wilson was counting the register. He looked worried. I asked him if everything was okay, and he just said business was slow. Told me I could start cleaning up early. Maya had stopped writing, hanging on James's every word. Around 8:30, most customers were gone. Mr. Wilson told the waitress, "Betty, she could go home." It was just me and him left. He went into his office while I finished cleaning the kitchen. James leaned forward, his voice almost a whisper now. That's when I heard the bell over the front door. I figured it was a late customer, but Mr. Wilson had already turned the sign to closed. I heard men's voices, then Mr. Wilson greeting them. "Gentlemen," he said, "what can I do for you?" He sounded nervous. James's eyes met Maya's. I peeked through the kitchen door. 3 men in suits were standing there. I recognized them all. Lawrence Carter, who owned the hardware store, Richard Bell, the bank manager, and Sheriff Dawson himself. The room seemed to grow quieter. Mr. Wilson invited them into his office. I went back to cleaning the grill, but I could hear their voices getting louder. They were arguing about something. I couldn't make out the words at first, just the angry tone. James closed his eyes, as if seeing it all again. Then I heard Sheriff Dawson say, "You're making a big mistake, Frank." Clear as day, I heard it. And that's when I did something I'm not proud of. Something that's haunted me for 60 years. Maya waited silently as James gathered himself. Crept closer to Mr. Wilson's office. There was a storage closet right next to it where we kept extra supplies. I slipped inside and put my ear to the wall. I could hear everything they were saying. Everything. James opened his eyes, looking directly at Maya. And what I heard that night changed everything. James fell silent for a moment. Maya waited patiently, her pen poised over her notebook. The ticking of the old clock on the wall seemed suddenly loud in the quiet room. It was so hot in that storage closet. James finally continued, "No windows, just walls of canned goods and cleaning supplies. I could barely breathe, but I didn't dare move. There was a small crack in the wall where the panels didn't quite meet. I could see a slice of Mr. Wilson's office through it." James closed his eyes, as if watching the scene unfold again. Mr. Wilson was sitting behind his desk. Sheriff Dawson was leaning forward, both hands on the desk. Carter and Bell stood behind him. They all looked angry, but Mr. Wilson looked scared. I'd never seen him scared before. He opened his eyes again. Sheriff Dawson spoke first. "Frank," he said, "this has gone on long enough. You need to close that back room. No more serving colored in your establishment." James's voice took on a different tone as he recited the words from memory. Mr. Wilson shook his head. "I can't do that, Sheriff. Those customers keep my business afloat. Times are tough." And the sheriff laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Times are about to get a whole lot tougher if you don't start cooperating." Maya scribbled quickly, trying to capture every detail. Carter stepped forward then. He said, "Frank, we've known each other 30 years. I'm telling you as a friend. Things are changing too fast. People are scared. They need to know where businesses in this town stand." James reached for his glass of water, took a small sip. Mr. Wilson looked right at them and said, "I stand for making a living. That's all I've ever stood for." But Bell shook his head. "That's not good enough anymore, Frank. There's a line being drawn. You need to decide which side you're on." James set the glass down carefully. The sheriff pulled up a chair and sat down. His voice got quieter, which somehow made it more frightening. "Let me make this clear, Frank," he said. "Either you stop serving those people, or we'll consider your business a problem for this community. And we solve problems in this town." James paused, his hands tightening around the armrests of his chair. Mr. Wilson didn't back down. "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" he asked. And Dawson smiled. "Just stating facts. Bad things happen to businesses that don't respect our way of life. Fire hazards, vandalism, banking issues." He looked at Bell when he said that last part. Maya had stopped writing, completely absorbed in the story. Then Mr. Wilson surprised me. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small tape recorder. "I've been recording these visits," he said. "I've got 3 tapes full of threats from you gentlemen. My brother in Birmingham has copies." James shook his head in wonder. "You should have seen their faces." Sheriff Dawson turned red as a tomato. He reached for the recorder, but Mr. Wilson pulled it back. "Touch that," he said. "And my brother sends the tapes to the FBI." The memory brought a small smile to James's face. Carter started trying to smooth things over. "Now, Frank. Nobody's threatening anybody here. We're just having a conversation between old friends." But Mr. Wilson wasn't having it. "We're not friends," he said, "and this conversation is over." James leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. That's when Sheriff Dawson changed tactics. He sat back, all calm-like. "Fine, Frank," he said. "Run your business how you want. But don't say we didn't warn you when things get rough around here." And then he said something that made my blood run cold. Maya leaned closer. The sheriff said, "There's going to be a message sent this Sunday. A message the whole county will understand. After that, folks like you will either get in line or get out of town." James's hands had started to shake again. Carter looked nervous then. "Sheriff," he said, "we agreed not to discuss." But Dawson cut him off. "Frank needs to understand the stakes," he said. Then he looked right at Mr. Wilson. "Sunday night, during that so-called prayer meeting at Bethel Church, when those troublemakers are all gathered together, there's going to be a demonstration of community resolve." James's voice had gone hoarse. Mr. Wilson went pale. "What are you planning?" he asked. And Belle stepped in. "Nothing that concerns you, Frank, unless you make it your concern." Maya had resumed writing, her pen moving rapidly across the page. Sheriff Dawson stood up then. "Just a little fire and brimstone," he said, and laughed. "Seems fitting for a church, don't you think? Not enough to hurt anyone. Just enough to scare some sense into them." James's face darkened with the memory. Oh, he knew what he meant right away. They were planning to set fire to Bethel Church during the SNCC meeting. The meeting my brother William helped organize. The meeting my whole family would be attending. He took another sip of water, his hand trembling. Mr. Wilson knew it too. "You can't do that," he said. "There will be women and children there." And Dawson just shrugged. "Then they should stay home where they belong." James shook his head. Carter looked uncomfortable. "It's just a small fire, Frank. On the steps. A warning. No one's going to get hurt." But the way Sheriff Dawson smiled, I knew he had other ideas. Maya's eyes were wide. Belle put his hand on Mr. Wilson's shoulder. "All this goes away if you just put a whites only sign in your window tomorrow. Simple as that. Otherwise, we can't be responsible for what happens to the church or to this diner." James sat back, exhausted by the memory. Mr. Wilson didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "I'll think about it overnight." James rubbed his eyes. Sheriff Dawson seemed pleased with himself. "Smart man, Frank. Sleep on it. We'll check back tomorrow." Then the three of them left. I heard the bell over the door jingle as they walked out. He looked down at his hands. I stayed frozen in that closet. Couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. My mind was racing. The church meeting was in 5 days. My family would be there. Dozens of people would be there. And these men were planning to set it on fire. James's voice grew softer. After a few minutes, I heard Mr. Wilson's chair scrape against the floor. He went to the front door and locked it. Then he came back to his office. I heard him on the phone, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. He sighed deeply. I knew I had to get out of there. I waited until I heard Mr. Wilson hang up the phone. Then I slipped out of the closet as quietly as I could and went back to the kitchen. I made some noise with the pots and pans, like I'd been working there the whole time. James looked directly at Maya. Mr. Wilson came into the kitchen a few minutes later. He looked tired, older somehow. "You can finish up tomorrow, James," he said. "Go on home now." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I hung up my apron and headed for the back door. James paused. As I was leaving, Mr. Wilson called after me. "James?" he said. I turned around, heart pounding. Did he know I'd been listening? But he just looked at me for a long moment. "Be careful out there," he finally said. I nodded and left quickly. James rubbed the back of his neck. The walk home that night was the longest of my life. It was dark, and every shadow made me jump. What was I supposed to do with what I'd heard? Tell my parents? Tell William? Go to the police? The sheriff was the police, and he was part of it. His face showed the weight of the decision he'd faced. I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't just do nothing. People's lives were at stake. My family's lives. But if I spoke up, I'd have to admit I was eavesdropping. I might lose my job, and if these men found out I was the one who exposed their plan... James shook his head. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do. By morning, I'd made my decision. He looked at Maya, his eyes filled with the memory of that long-ago night. I decided I would tell Mr. Wilson that I'd overheard everything. He seemed to be standing up to them. Maybe he would know what to do, who to call for help. I would go in early for my shift and talk to him privately. James's voice grew heavy with emotion. But when I got to Wilson's Diner the next day, everything had changed. James's eyes clouded with the memory. He reached for the pocket watch on the side table, holding it tightly in his palm. I arrived early, around 6 in the morning. Usually, I was the first one there after Mr. Wilson. He'd open up, start the coffee, and I'd come in to prep for breakfast. But that morning, there were police cars parked outside. Their lights were flashing, painting the street red and blue. Maya shifted forward in her seat. My first thought was that they'd somehow found out I'd been listening, that they'd come for me. James shook his head. I almost turned and ran. But then I saw the ambulance. He took a deep breath. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Mrs. Peterson from the dress shop, Mr. Green from the barber shop, a few others. They were all whispering to each other. I walked up slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. James's voice grew softer. I asked Mrs. Peterson what happened. "It's Frank Wilson," she said. "They found him this morning when Betty came to open up. Looks like his heart gave out." He looked down at the pocket watch in his hand. The world seemed to tilt under my feet. Mr. Wilson was dead. The only person I could have told about what I heard was gone, and all I could think was, did they do this? Did they come back and hurt him after I left? Maya stopped writing. "You thought they might have killed him?" James nodded slowly. It crossed my mind. Sheriff Dawson had made threats. What if they'd come back to continue their conversation and things had gone wrong? Or what if they did it on purpose, to keep him quiet? He placed the watch carefully back on the table. I stood there watching as they brought Mr. Wilson out on a stretcher, a sheet covering his face. Betty was crying on the sidewalk. She'd worked for him for 20 years. James closed his eyes briefly. Dr. Morris came out of the diner. He was the town doctor, an older white man with thick glasses. Sheriff Dawson was right behind him. The sheriff was talking loudly, saying it looked like a heart attack. "Poor Frank," he kept saying, "the stress of running a business." But he was smiling when he thought no one was looking. James's face hardened at the memory. I slipped away before the sheriff saw me. I walked home in a daze. My mind was racing. If they had killed Mr. Wilson, what would they do to me if they found out I knew their plan? And even if it was a real heart attack, Who could I tell now? He shifted in his chair. I spent that whole day wrestling with myself. If I spoke up, I'd have to explain why I was eavesdropping. I might lose my job. College might disappear. And my family could face retaliation from Sheriff Dawson. James looked at Maya earnestly. You have to understand how powerful Dawson was in Oakwood. He could make a traffic ticket turn into jail time. He could get people fired. Homes could burn down, and the fire department might be too late to help. That's how things worked back. Then, Maya nodded. I understand, Mr. Walker. But if I stayed quiet, James continued, people could get hurt at that church meeting. My own family could get hurt. How could I live with myself if something happened and I'd done nothing? He rubbed his forehead. I thought maybe the plan would die with Mr. Wilson. Maybe without his diner as an example, they wouldn't need to send a message anymore. But I couldn't count on that. James stood up slowly and walked to the window again. I finally decided to tell my father. He was wise, respected in our community. He would know what to do. I practiced what I would say, how I would explain everything. He turned back to face Maya. But when he came home from work that day, William was with him. They were arguing about the Sunday meeting. Daddy wanted our family to stay home, said. He had a bad feeling. William was insisting we all needed to be there, to show support. James sat down again heavily. I couldn't bring myself to say anything. Not with William there. He was so fired up, so determined. If I told them about the threat, William might do something reckless. He might confront Dawson directly or try to catch them in the act. Either way, he could get himself killed. James looked down at his hands, so I kept quiet. I told myself I'd find another way. Maybe I could warn Reverend Parker privately. Maybe I could call the FBI anonymously, like Mr. Wilson had threatened to do. He sighed deeply. The diner stayed closed the rest of the week. The funeral was on Thursday. I went, standing at the back of the church. Sheriff Dawson was there in the front pew, looking solemn. Carter and Bell were right beside him. I kept thinking about Mr. Wilson's recording. Where were those tapes now? Did his brother in Birmingham really have copies? James shook his head. By Saturday, I still hadn't done anything. I felt paralyzed. Every option seemed dangerous or impossible. That night, I developed a fever. My forehead was burning up, and I was shaking with chills. A small, sad smile crossed his face. Looking back, I think it was just stress and fear. But at the time, it seemed like a way out, a reason to stay home from the church meeting. My mother felt my head Sunday morning and insisted I stay in bed. You're not going anywhere with a fever like that, she said. James's eyes met Maya's. The rest of my family got ready for church. William kept looking at me disappointedly, like I was faking to avoid supporting the cause. Maybe part of me was. I don't know anymore. He closed his eyes, remembering. As they were leaving, my father came to my bedside. You rest, son, he said. We'll be back after the meeting. And I just nodded, tears in my eyes. I couldn't tell if they were from the fever or from shame. James opened his eyes again. After they left, I couldn't stay in bed. I paced the floor, watching the clock. The meeting started at 7. By 7:30, I couldn't stand it anymore. I put on my clothes, still feeling dizzy and hot, and ran all the way to Bethel Church. His voice grew urgent with the memory. I was planning to burst in, to shout a warning, to get everyone out. But when I got there, James paused, a look of confusion crossing his face, even after all these years. The church was perfectly fine. No fire, No smoke, no Sheriff Dawson, or his friends lurking around. Just people singing hymns inside. Light pouring from the stained glass windows. Cars parked peacefully along the street. Maya tilted her head. Nothing happened? Nothing. James shook his head in disbelief. I stood across the street, catching my breath, waiting for something to happen. My shirt was soaked with sweat from running and from the fever. But minutes passed, and everything was normal. He leaned back in his chair. I felt like I was in a dream. Had I imagined the whole conversation at the diner? Was my fever making me confused? But no, I remembered every word they'd said, every threat. James rubbed his eyes, as if trying to clear the memory. I decided to go inside. Maybe they were planning to strike later, during the meeting. I needed to be there, to watch, to warn everyone if necessary. He took a sip of water. I slipped into the back row. The church was full. Nearly every black person in Oakwood was there. Reverend Parker was speaking about courage and faith. My family was sitting near the front. I could see the back of William's head, my mother's hat, my father's broad shoulders. James's voice softened. The meeting went on. Prayers, songs, speeches. Representatives from other churches in nearby towns spoke about their own protests and sit-ins. Plans were made for more actions in Oakwood. Everyone was fired up, hopeful. He looked down at his hands. 2 hours passed. Nothing happened. No fire, no threat, no Sheriff Dawson. The meeting ended with everyone holding hands and singing, "We shall overcome." And then, people just went home. Maya looked confused. So, the men never carried out their threat? James shook his head. They didn't. I watched my family walk to our car. I watched other families leave. I even stayed behind, hiding in the shadows across the street, until the last person left, and Reverend Parker locked up the church. Nothing happened. He stood up slowly and walked to his bookshelf, pulling out a faded newspaper clipping. I went home that night completely confused. Had they called it off? Why? Was it because of Mr. Wilson's death? I tossed and turned all night, still feverish, trying to make sense of it. James handed the yellowed clipping to Maya. Then, 2 weeks later, this appeared in the Oakwood Gazette. Maya carefully unfolded the brittle paper. The headline read, "3 local men arrested in bombing plot. Sheriff Dawson, Lawrence Carter, and Richard Bell," James said quietly. Arrested by FBI agents for conspiracy to commit arson and civil rights violations. An anonymous tip had led agents to evidence in Carter's hardware store. Gasoline cans, fuses, timers. Maya looked up from the article. So someone did report them. James nodded. Someone did, but it wasn't me. He returned to his chair. The article said the FBI had been watching them for weeks, that an informant had provided recordings of the men planning attacks on civil rights meetings. Recordings. James's eyes met Maya's. Like the ones Mr. Wilson said he had. Maya's eyes widened. Mr. Wilson reported them before he died. That's what I finally realized, James said. He must have called his brother in Birmingham that night after they left, sent the tapes out. His brother must have taken them to the FBI. James ran his hand over his face. For 60 years, I've lived with the knowledge that I was a coward, that I kept silent while others spoke up, that I chose my own safety over what was right. He leaned forward, his voice intense. I never told anyone what I heard that night. Not my parents, not my brother, not my wife. I went off to college as planned, got my teaching degree, came back to Oakwood, and taught science for 42 years. James gestured around his living room. I built a good life, a family, respect in the community, all while carrying the weight of my silence, all while believing that my silence could have cost lives if someone else hadn't been braver than me. His voice grew softer. After the arrests, things changed in Oakwood. Not overnight, but gradually. A new sheriff was appointed. The whites-only signs came down, one by one. My brother William became a deacon at Bethel Church. My parents lived to see me become a teacher, to see their grandchildren grow up. James looked at the pocket watch again. Wilson's Diner was sold. Over the years, it became other things: a hardware store, a beauty salon, and finally, that civil rights museum you mentioned. I've never set foot in that building again. Not once in 60 years. Maya wrote quietly, then looked up. Mr. Walker, I understand the guilt you've carried, but in the end, nothing bad happened. The plot was stopped. Your family was safe. James nodded slowly. That's true, and maybe that should have been enough. He paused. But there's something I've wondered every day for 60 years. Something that's haunted me. He leaned forward. What if Mr. Wilson wasn't the anonymous tipster? What if someone else reported them? What if my silence really did cost something precious? Maya looked confused. I'm not sure I understand. Mr. Wilson died that night, James said quietly. Right after those men left. Right after he stood up to them. Was it really just a heart attack? Or did they come back later? Did they hurt him to keep him quiet? James's eyes filled with tears. If I had spoken up immediately, if I had gone to someone that very night, could I have saved him? Could I have prevented his death? That's the question that's haunted me for 60 years. He wiped his eyes. I'll never know the answer. And that's been my punishment. Maya set her notebook aside. Mr. Walker, you were 17. You were scared. You were trying to protect your family, your future. I know, James said. My head knows that. But my heart... He placed his hand over his chest. My heart has never accepted it. They sat in silence for a moment. There's one more thing, James finally said. One more piece to this story. Something I've never told anyone. Something that explains why I'm finally breaking my silence after all these years. Maya picked up her notebook again. What is it, Mr. Walker? James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. 3 months ago, I received this in the mail. It had been sitting in an old post office box for 60 years. He carefully opened the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. It's from Frank Wilson. Maya stared at the yellowed envelope in James's hands. How is that possible? You said he died that night. He wrote it the night he died, James explained, and mailed it to himself at a post office box. The letter explains it all. He carefully folded the paper and put it back in the envelope. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. He set the envelope on the table next to the pocket watch. To understand why this letter means so much, you need to know about the decades between that night and now, about the weight of silence I've carried all these years. Maya nodded, turning to a fresh page in her notebook. After that Sunday, life went on. The 3 men went to prison. Not for long, just a few years, but long enough to change things. In Oakwood. I went off to college as planned. James smiled faintly. Tuskegee was everything I'd dreamed of. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by black professors, black doctors, black scientists, people who looked like me, showing me what was possible. His smile faded. But even there, I couldn't escape what happened. Every night, I'd dream about that storage closet, about the voices through the wall. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, wondering if I could have done something different. He picked up a framed photo from a side table, a young man in a cap and gown. I graduated in 1967 with a degree in education. I wanted to be a doctor, but medical school was too expensive. So I became a science teacher instead. Came back to Oakwood because that's where I was needed most. James set the photo down. By then, things were changing. Slowly, painfully, but changing. The Civil Rights Act had passed. The Voting Rights Act, too. The whites-only signs were gone. But the attitudes, those changed much more slowly. He shook his head. I started teaching at the high school in fall of 1967. The schools were still segregated then, even though they weren't supposed to be. It wasn't until 1969 that Oakwood finally integrated the schools. And that first year was tough. So tough. James rubbed his eyes. There were fights every day. Insults. Threats. Some white parents pulled their children out, started a private academy across town. But we kept going, teaching, learning, trying to build something new. He looked at Maya. I met my wife, Evelyn, that year. She was the English teacher, 2 classrooms down from mine. The smartest, kindest woman I ever knew. We married in 1970, had our first child in 71. James gestured to the photos on the wall. Through it all, teaching, marriage, children, I carried that night with me. That secret. Every time there was a civil rights victory, I'd think about how I'd almost stayed silent in the face of violence. Every time there was a setback, a church bombing, a beating, an assassination, I'd wonder if my silence had somehow contributed to the larger silence that allowed such things to happen. His voice grew softer. I became active in the community, joined the NAACP, registered voters, served on committees, did everything I could to make up for that one moment of hesitation, of fear. James's eyes met Maya's, but I never told anyone what I heard that night. Not my parents. They passed away in the 1980s, never knowing. Not my brother William. He became a minister, died in 2002. Not even Evelyn knew, and we shared everything. He touched the pocket watch gently. This was Mr. Wilson's. I found it on my porch the morning after he died. It was wrapped in a handkerchief with a note that just said, "For James." No signature. I never knew how it came to me or who left it there. James turned the watch over in his hands. I kept it all these years. A reminder of my silence, of the choice I made. Sometimes I'd take it out at night, after Evelyn was asleep, and just look at it. Wonder about the man who owned it. Wonder if I could have saved him. Maya leaned forward. Did you ever find out exactly how Mr. Wilson died? James shook his head. Heart attack, according to the official report. He had a history of heart problems, apparently. But I always wondered. He set the watch down carefully. Over the years, I watched Oakwood change. The children I taught grew up, had children of their own. Some of those children became my students too. I taught science to 3 generations of Oakwood families before I retired in 2009. James smiled sadly. I like to think I made a difference. That all those science lessons, all those young minds I helped shape, that it somehow balanced the scales for that one moment of fear when I was 17. He glanced at the pictures on the wall. Our children grew up, moved away. David is a doctor in Atlanta. The one thing I couldn't be, he became. Susan is a lawyer in Chicago. Michael teaches at Howard University. And our youngest, Karen, runs a community center right here in Oakwood. I'm proud of all of them. James's voice cracked slightly. Evelyn died 5 years ago. Breast cancer. She fought it for 3 years, never lost her smile. After she was gone, the silence in this house became deeper, and the weight of my old secret seemed heavier somehow. He looked down at his hands. I thought about telling my children, leaving some kind of record, some explanation. But what would I say? Your father was a coward once? Your father might have saved a man's life but chose to stay quiet? So I kept silent, like I had for decades. James gestured to the envelope on the table. Then, 3 months ago, this arrived. A letter from a ghost, found when they were clearing out the old post office downtown to turn it into apartments. Box 217 had been rented by Frank Wilson in 1963. The payment ran out years ago, but the box was never emptied. They found this inside, addressed to Frank Wilson himself. He picked up the envelope. The postmaster recognized my name as a longtime resident. He brought it to me. Thought I might know how to find Wilson's family. When I saw the date on the postmark, August 12, 1963, the night Mr. Wilson died, I nearly collapsed. James looked at Maya, his eyes bright with emotion. For 60 years, I've lived with questions that had no answers. Was it my fault Mr. Wilson died? Could I have saved him? Was he murdered because of what he knew? And most of all, why did his pocket watch come to me? He held up the envelope. This letter answers those questions. And that's why, after 60 years of silence, I'm finally ready to tell the whole story. Because now I know the truth. Maya sat forward eagerly. What does the letter say, Mr. Walker? James took a deep breath. It explains everything. But first, there's something else you need to know. Something I found out 2 weeks after that night at the diner. James reached for the shoebox he had shown Maya earlier. He dug through old papers and photos until he found another newspaper, clipping, even more yellowed and fragile than the first. This article appeared in the Birmingham Times, he said, carefully unfolding it. Chantrafidu, not the Oakwood paper. My father brought it home. Said I should see it, though he didn't know why it would matter to me particularly. He handed the brittle paper to Maya. The headline read, FBI credits anonymous tip in Oakwood arrests. The article goes into more detail than our local paper did, James explained. It mentions that an unnamed source provided recordings of the 3 men planning the attack on Bethel Church. It says the recordings were delivered to the FBI office in Birmingham the morning after Mr. Wilson died. Maya skimmed the article, then looked up. So it was definitely Mr. Wilson who reported them. James nodded. That's what I realized when I read it. He must have mailed the tapes to his brother that night after I left. His brother took them to the FBI the next day. He leaned back in his chair. For 60 years, I've lived with the knowledge that while I kept silent out of fear, Mr. Wilson did the right thing, even knowing the risks. And then he died. Maybe because of his brave choice. James's voice grew softer. I've carried 2 burdens all these years. First, that I was a coward when bravery was needed. And second, that my silence might have contributed to Mr. Wilson's death. If I had spoken up immediately, maybe we could have gone to the authorities together. Maybe he wouldn't have been alone when he took his stand. He rubbed his eyes. So I built my life trying to make up for that moment of fear, teaching generations of young people, standing up for what's right in my community, making sure I never again stayed silent in the face of injustice. Maya set the clipping aside carefully. It sounds like you've lived a life of courage and integrity, Mr. Walker. James shook his head. I tried. But that one moment of failure has always haunted me. That's why the letter means so much. He picked up the envelope from the table. When I first opened this 3 months ago, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely read it. The handwriting was just as I remembered. Mr. Wilson's neat, precise script. James took a deep breath. The letter is dated August the 12th, 1963, the night he died. He wrote it, mailed it to himself at the post office box, and then went back to the diner. He never lived to open it. He carefully removed the letter and unfolded it. "To whom it may concern," James read aloud, "my name is Frank Wilson. I am the owner of Wilson's Diner in Oakwood, Alabama. If you are reading this letter, something has happened to me, and I want to set the record straight." James paused, his voice thick with emotion. "This evening, August 12th, 1963, Sheriff Theodore Dawson, Lawrence Carter, and Richard Bell came to my diner. They threatened me and my business because I serve Negro customers. They also revealed plans to set fire to Bethel Church this Sunday. During a civil rights meeting, Maya listened intently as James continued. I have recorded this conversation and several previous threats. I have sent these recordings to my brother, Samuel Wilson, in Birmingham, with instructions to take them to the FBI if anything happens to me. I have a heart condition, and the stress of these events has taken a toll. If I die of natural causes, I want it known that these men are still responsible." James's hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. "I don't expect to live much longer. My doctor has warned me that my heart could fail at any time, but I cannot go to my grave knowing I stood by while good people were harmed. I may not have spoken up enough in life, but I will not be silent in death." James took a deep breath before continuing. "There is a young man who works for me, James Walker. He is a good boy with a bright future. I believe he overheard the conversation tonight from the storage room. If he did, I hope he understands that his silence is not a failure of character. He has his whole life ahead of him, and speaking out would put everything at risk." James stopped, his eyes filling with tears. "He knew," he whispered. "He knew I was listening." After a moment, he continued reading. "I am an old man with little to lose. James is young, with everything to gain. I have made my choice freely, knowing the risks. I hope James makes his choice with the same freedom, unburdened by false guilt. Some burdens are not meant for young shoulders." James carefully folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. The last paragraph says he left me his pocket watch as a reminder that time moves forward, and we must move with it, that carrying the past too long becomes a weight that prevents progress. He picked up the watch, turning it over in his palm. For 60 years, I thought this watch was a reminder of my failure. Now I know it was meant as permission to move forward, to live my life without the burden of that night. Maya sat quietly, absorbing everything she had heard. "Mr. Wilson made his choice, knowing the risks," James said softly. "He chose to act, even knowing it might cost him his life. And he chose to protect me, to give me a future." He set the watch down gently. The letter doesn't say who left the watch on my porch. I suspect it was Mr. Wilson's brother. He must have found it among Frank's things, along with instructions about what to do with it. James looked at Maya. "So now you understand why I'm finally breaking my silence. For 60 years, I thought I had failed a test of courage, that my silence might have cost a man his life. Now I know that Mr. Wilson saw my silence not as cowardice, but as self-preservation. that he wanted me to go on, to build a life, to make a difference in my own way. Maya had stopped writing, simply listening. "I've never set foot in that building again," James said. "Not when it was a hardware store, not when it was a beauty salon, and not now that it's a museum. I couldn't face the memory of that night. But next week, I'm going there for the first time in 60 years. I'm going to donate Mr. Wilson's pocket watch and his letter to the museum." He smiled sadly. "It's time for that history to be known, for Mr. Wilson's courage to be remembered, and for my burden to be set down at last." Maya finally spoke. "Thank you for sharing this with me, Mr. Walker. It's an incredible story." James nodded. "But there's one last thing I haven't told you. One final piece of this story that I've never shared with anyone." Maya looked puzzled. "What is it?" James took a deep breath. "Remember when I told you about finding the pocket watch on my porch the morning after Mr. Wilson died?" Maya nodded. "I didn't tell you everything about that morning. There was something else, something that's haunted me even more than the watch itself." He looked directly at Maya, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and relief. "That morning, standing on my porch, looking down at that pocket watch wrapped in a handkerchief, I made a decision that shaped the next 60 years of my life." James's hands were steady now as he reached again for the pocket watch. The afternoon light caught its worn silver surface, reflecting in small flashes across the room. "When I found the watch, there was a small key with it, a tiny silver key I didn't recognize." He turned the watch over and pointed to a small keyhole on the back that Maya hadn't noticed before. "This watch is special. It has a hidden compartment inside. Most people wouldn't know it was there." With careful fingers, James produced a small key from his shirt pocket. He inserted it into the back of the watch and turned it gently. A small panel on the back of the watch popped open. Inside was this. He removed a tightly folded scrap of paper, yellowed with age, and handed it to Maya. She carefully unfolded it. In the same neat handwriting as the letter, it read, "James, I know you heard everything. Meet me at 5 a.m. tomorrow to discuss what to do. Tell no one." "FW," Maya looked up in surprise. "He was planning to meet with you." James nodded, his eyes distant. "He knew I was in that storage closet. He left this note with the watch, because he couldn't risk speaking to me directly that night, with the sheriff possibly watching the diner. He took back the note, folding it carefully. When I found the watch the next morning, I had no idea Mr. Wilson was already dead. I thought he had left it for me with instructions to meet him. But when I got to the diner and saw the police cars..." James's voice caught. He cleared his throat before continuing. "That's when I made my decision. I could have stepped forward right then, told the police what I had overheard, explained that Mr. Wilson had asked to meet me. But I was scared. So scared." He placed the note back in the watch's secret compartment. "I told myself Mr. Wilson must have changed his mind about meeting me, that he had decided to handle it himself, that he didn't need me to speak up." James closed the compartment with a soft click. "For 60 years, I've wondered if meeting him might have changed everything. If he would still be alive if I had gone to the diner earlier, if he died waiting for me, thinking I had abandoned him." He set the watch down gently. "That question has haunted me far more than whether I should have reported what I heard. It was personal. A man reached out to me for help, and I wasn't there." Maya spoke softly. "But you didn't know he wanted to meet until after he had already died." "That's true," James acknowledged. "But part of me has always wondered if I could have somehow saved him, if I'd been braver, faster, more decisive that night. If I had gone straight to his house after leaving the diner, instead of going home? If I had spoken up immediately instead of waiting and weighing my options? He looked down at his hands. Finding that letter 3 months ago changed everything. Now I know he never blamed me. He understood my position, my youth, my potential future. He made his choice knowingly, willingly, and he wanted me to live without guilt. James looked up at Maya. But I've never told anyone about this note in the watch. Not in 60 years. It felt too personal, too painful, like the final proof of my failure. He took a deep breath. When I donate the watch to the museum next week, I'm not going to include this note. Some things should remain private, between Mr. Wilson and me. A reminder that even our smallest choices can echo through a lifetime. Maya set her notebook aside. Mr. Walker, it seems to me that Mr. Wilson made his choice with full knowledge and a generous heart. He wouldn't want you to carry this weight for so long. James smiled sadly. I know that now. Reading his letter was like being forgiven for a sin I've carried my whole life. Like finally being able to breathe fully after decades of shallow breaths. He gestured to the photos on his walls. I've had a good life. 4 wonderful children. 9 grandchildren who make me proud. A career teaching young minds. A community that respects me. And Evelyn. 50 years with the most extraordinary woman I've ever known. His smile softened. But, even in the happiest moments, that question was always there in the back of my mind. Could I have done more? Should I have done more? Was someone else paying the price for my silence? James stood up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his front yard. Mr. Wilson's letter freed me from that question. He chose his path knowingly. He saw me, really saw me, a scared 17-year-old with dreams bigger than his courage at that moment. And he chose to carry the burden himself. He turned back to Maya. That's why I wanted to tell this story now. Not just for myself, but for him. His courage deserves to be remembered, and for all the others who made quiet choices during those dangerous times. Choices that didn't make headlines, but changed lives nonetheless. James returned to his chair. So many stories from those days focus on the grand gestures, the famous speeches, the dramatic confrontations. But change also happened in small diners, in whispered conversations, in anonymous tips, in silent sacrifices. He picked up the pocket watch one more time. Frank Wilson wasn't a civil rights leader. He was just a man trying to run a business, to be fair in an unfair world. But when the moment came, he chose courage over safety. He chose what was right over what was easy. James looked at Maya, his eyes clear and direct. And now I can finally choose to forgive myself, to accept that my life since then, every student I taught, every vote I cast, every stand I took, has been my way of honoring his sacrifice, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet, daily choice to live with integrity and purpose. He set the watch down a final time. That's my story, Maya. 60 years of silence, finally broken. A burden finally set down. Maya closed her notebook. Thank you for trusting me with it, Mr. Walker. James nodded. Time moves forward, he said, echoing Mr. Wilson's words. And we must move with it. Outside, the shadows lengthened across the yard, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, marking the hour. That was the end of this story about an elderly black man who finally revealed the truth after 60 years of silence. Where are you listening from? We'd love to know in the comments. If you enjoyed this storytelling journey, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more intriguing stories like this one. Don't forget to share with your friends and family to help spread kindness and awareness about the quiet heroes of history whose small choices made big differences. Thank you for listening.